What if the secret of becoming one of the richest nations on Earth begins with having almost nothing? Singapore occupies barely 735 square kilometers, a speck of land smaller than many major cities. It has no oil fields, no coal reserves, and no vast agricultural heartland. Much of its water, food, and energy must come from beyond its borders. Yet this tiny island of only a few million people consistently ranks among the world's wealthiest countries by income per person. That is not merely an economic success story. It is a national paradox. How does a country without natural wealth create extraordinary financial wealth? Was Singapore enriched by geography, disciplined government, human talent, or by running itself less like a traditional state and more like a highly focused enterprise? To understand the answer, return to 1965. Singapore had just separated from Malaysia, not in triumph, but under a cloud of uncertainty. Its domestic market was tiny, unemployment was high, housing was scarce, ethnic tensions were real. The new nation had no powerful military, no protective hinterland, and no valuable commodity it could simply dig up and sell. By conventional logic, it was too small, too exposed, and too dependent to become prosperous. But Singapore turned those weaknesses into design constraints. If it could not profit from what lay beneath the ground, it would profit from what moved across it. It monetized location, educated its people, built institutional trust, reduced friction, and made speed a competitive advantage. Singapore learned that ships, capital, talent, and information all seek the same thing: a place where rules are clear, infrastructure works, and promises are kept. Then it organized the entire country around providing exactly that. Smallness in this model was not only a handicap. It also made coordination easier. Policies could be implemented quickly, aligned across agencies, measured closely, and corrected before failure became permanent. Where larger nations often struggle to turn decisions into action, Singapore could behave like a compact system with a single strategic direction. This did not make every policy wise, nor did it eliminate social costs. But it made execution unusually consistent, and consistency became one of the country's most valuable assets. The transformation is visible in a single contrast: archival images of crowded docks and precarious housing beside today's Marina Bay skyline, global banks, automated terminals, and immaculate transport networks. The distance between those two Singapores was not crossed by luck alone. It was crossed through deliberate choices about trade, education, housing, law, investment, and survival. Singapore became rich not because it possessed more, but because it learned to make more from every square kilometer, every worker, every hour, and every degree of credibility. It had no oil mine, but it sat directly beside a greater gold mine, the maritime route connecting east and west. That maritime route narrows at the Strait of Malacca, one of the most important gateways between the Indian Ocean, the South China Sea, and the Pacific. A significant share of global seaborne trade passes through this corridor. Cargo from the Middle East, Europe, China, Japan, and Southeast Asia converges near Singapore before continuing toward distant markets. But geography did not automatically produce wealth. Singapore refused to behave like a roadside collector charging ships simply for passing by. It built deep-water ports, modern cranes, vast storage facilities, and a custom system designed for speed. Faster clearance meant less idle time, lower fuel use, and smaller costs for shipping companies. Reliability encouraged them to return, schedule more routes, and base regional operations there. Around the port, an entire economy took shape. Logistics firms moved containers. Insurers covered maritime risks. Shipyards repaired vessels. Banks financed cargo, while commercial lawyers resolved disputes. Each service captured value from trade without owning the goods themselves. The harbor was no longer just infrastructure. It became a platform on which many profitable industries could operate. Oil reveals this strategy most clearly. Singapore has no crude reserves, yet it became a major refining and trading center. Tankers bring in crude oil. Refineries transform it into fuels, chemicals, and other higher-value products. Storage terminals hold supplies. Traders connect buyers with sellers, and ships carry the finished output abroad. Singapore earns not from extracting oil, but from processing, financing, storing, pricing, and moving it. This same logic expanded beyond the sea. Changi Airport turned the island into an air hub for passengers and time-sensitive cargo. Telecommunications networks and submarine cables made it a node for data as well. Geography created proximity, but infrastructure converted proximity into revenue. Openness was equally essential. With a domestic market too small to sustain prosperity on its own, Singapore kept trade barriers low and signed agreements that connected local and foreign companies to much larger markets. A business operating from Singapore could serve not merely millions of residents nearby, but billions of customers across Asia and beyond. Yet strategic locations are not rare. Many countries sit beside busy sea lanes, natural crossroads, or major markets without becoming wealthy. A map can offer an advantage, but it cannot unload a ship, enforce a contract, clear cargo quickly, or reassure an investor. Singapore's distinction was the combination: a modern port, efficient administration, predictable law, long-term planning, and disciplined management. Location gave Singapore passing traffic. Competence persuaded that traffic to stop, spend, invest, and return. In this way, flows of ships became flows of capital, jobs, knowledge, and opportunity. But even an excellent port cannot by itself create a rich nation. Singapore still needed something harder to construct than concrete and steel, and far easier to lose: the enduring trust of the wider world. After independence, Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew and his government understood a difficult truth. Singapore's domestic market was too small to sustain prosperity. Survival required the country to become useful to the world. International companies had to see it as a place where they could manufacture, trade, invest, and establish regional headquarters with confidence. That confidence was built through predictability. Laws were enforced with relative consistency. Contracts and property rights received strong protection. Public agencies were expected to act quickly, efficiently, and accountably. Corruption was punished severely, reducing the hidden costs and arbitrary obstacles that burden businesses elsewhere. For investors, Singapore offered something rare: fewer unpleasant surprises. Rather than protecting every domestic industry from foreign competition, Singapore invited multinational corporations to bring capital, technology, expertise, and access to global markets. Jurong Industrial Estate became a physical declaration of intent. Swampland and unused terrain were transformed into factories, roads, and infrastructure, signaling that Singapore would move beyond entrepot, trade into production. The first factories relied heavily on labor, creating jobs for a young population. But Singapore did not remain at that level. It progressively moved into electronics, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, chemicals, and precision engineering. Each transition demanded better equipment, stronger institutions, and more advanced skills. Education, therefore, became an economic instrument, not merely a path to certificates. Schools and training institutes emphasized mathematics, science, technical competence, and languages. English became the common working language, while community languages remained part of national life. This reduced barriers among Singapore's ethnic groups and connected workers directly to international commerce. Finance grew around the port economy. Banks, insurers, foreign exchange dealers, asset managers, and trade finance specialists followed the movement of ships and goods. Singapore's time zone, positioned between East Asia and Western financial centers, added another advantage. When companies believed their money, contracts, and data would remain secure, they were more willing to locate regional operations there. A small population, however, could not supply every skill the economy required. Singapore invested heavily in its citizens, while also attracting international professionals. This expanded its pool of knowledge and experience, although it also created competition for jobs, pressure from immigration, and continuing debates over identity and belonging. Singapore's deeper achievement was turning reliability into an exportable product. Operating there could be expensive, but companies were willing to pay more for stable rules, excellent infrastructure, capable workers, and lower risk. Trust became an invisible asset, earning returns across factories, offices, banks, and trading floors. But GDP growth meant little if citizens still lived in overcrowded slums. Singapore now had to solve housing, savings, and social order at the same time. In the years after independence, overcrowding was not an abstract statistic. Families lived in cramped settlements where sanitation was poor, basic services were limited, and fires could spread rapidly. Singapore's government understood that housing was more than social assistance. A secure home could improve public health, strengthen families, and give citizens a tangible stake in the survival of the nation. The Housing and Development Board responded by building apartments on a massive scale. But these were not simply isolated concrete blocks. New towns were planned with schools, markets, transport links, parks, clinics, and other public services. Over time, HDB estates became the physical structure of everyday Singapore. Today, roughly 8 in 10 residents live in homes developed by the agency. Most are not conventional tenants. They purchase the right to occupy their apartments through long leases, commonly lasting 99 years. This encouraged a sense of ownership, while allowing the state to retain long-term influence over scarce land. That land policy was crucial. By controlling most of the national territory, the government could coordinate housing, ports, roads, railways, and industrial zones, instead of allowing each project to develop separately. When infrastructure increased the value of surrounding land, part of that value could return to the public system, supporting future investment. Yet this arrangement is not flawless. Questions about affordability, resale prices, lease expiration, and what happens as apartments age remain subjects of serious debate. Central coordination solved many problems, but it did not eliminate difficult trade-offs. Housing was connected to another powerful institution, the Central Provident Fund, or CPF. Workers and employers contributed part of each salary into mandatory savings accounts. These funds supported retirement and health care, and in many cases could be used to purchase a home. The system raised national savings, created pools of long-term capital, and reduced some of the pressure for welfare spending directly from annual taxes. Singapore also built state investment institutions with distinct responsibilities. Temasek manages a commercial portfolio that includes major companies, while GIC invests reserves globally for long-term returns. Their assets should not be mistaken for a single bank account that the government can spend freely. Each institution follows its own mandate and structure. Still, investment income strengthens Singapore's finances and helps transform accumulated savings into lasting national capacity. The result is a model difficult to fit into a simple ideological label. The state intervenes deeply in land, housing, savings, infrastructure, and strategic investment. At the same time, Singapore remains open to international capital, private enterprise, trade, and competition. It is neither a completely free market nor a traditional planned economy. It is a pragmatic hybrid, designed around constraints rather than doctrine. Once basic needs had been organized effectively, Singapore could begin selling something more valuable: quality, experience, and a national image. As wages rose, Singapore could no longer depend on factories competing mainly through cheap labor. Its response was not to resist higher costs, but to climb the value chain. Manufacturing shifted towards semiconductors, advanced electronics, pharmaceuticals, and precision engineering, while finance, technology, biomedical research, and professional services became increasingly important. Changi Airport captures this strategy in physical form. It is not merely a place where aircraft land and depart. Shopping districts, gardens, efficient services, and the immense indoor waterfall at Jewel turn transit time into a consumer experience. Even passengers who remain in Singapore for only a few hours can spend money, remember the city, and carry its brand elsewhere. The same logic shapes Singapore's vision of a city in a garden. Trees, reservoirs, parks, and carefully designed landscapes soften the pressure of high urban density. Gardens by the Bay and Marina Bay Sands provide something the country did not inherit from dramatic geography or centuries of monumental history. Singapore deliberately constructed symbolic assets, then used them to strengthen tourism, investment, and international recognition. Water reveals an even deeper form of adaptation. With limited natural freshwater, Singapore developed a diversified supply system based on imported water, reservoirs, rainwater collection, desalination, and newater. Its highly treated recycled water, a basic vulnerability, became a field of engineering expertise. What began as a survival problem eventually produced knowledge and technology that could be shared and exported. Today, the country is placing similar bets on artificial intelligence, financial technology, semiconductors, biomedicine, digital infrastructure, and clean energy. Autonomous vehicles and smart urban systems can be tested within a compact, closely managed environment. Because Singapore lacks a vast domestic market, it often presents itself instead as a laboratory where companies and policymakers can test technologies before expanding across the region. What Singapore ultimately sells is not cheapness. It sells safety, speed, dependable infrastructure, relatively clear rules, and access to Southeast Asia. Businesses pay a premium because uncertainty itself is expensive, and Singapore has built an economy around reducing it. But quality also carries a price. Living costs and property values are high. Academic competition is intense. Work can be demanding, and the birth rate remains extremely low. The economy also depends heavily on global trade, leaving it exposed to recessions, geopolitical conflict, and disruptions in supply chains. Limited land also forces difficult choices between housing, industry, transport, defense, and nature. So the final question is not simply how wealthy Singapore has become. It is whether this carefully engineered formula can continue working in a world changing faster, fragmenting politically, and becoming far less predictable. So, how rich is Singapore? By GDP per person, it consistently belongs among the wealthiest economies on Earth, although its exact position changes with the year and with whether wealth is measured in nominal terms or purchasing power. But its prosperity is also visible in world-class infrastructure, deep financial reserves, nationally owned investment assets, and a state capable of delivering reliable public services. Still, an average is not a household. High GDP per capita does not mean every Singaporean is equally wealthy. Income gaps remain, housing costs matter, and daily life can feel expensive even inside an exceptionally productive economy. National wealth gives Singapore room to act, but it does not remove the pressure felt by families competing for space, education, security, and opportunity. The achievement rests on 6 engines working together. Singapore exploited a strategic position on a vital maritime route. It built ports, airports, housing, and utilities before demand fully arrived. It created laws and an administration that investors could trust. It welcomed global capital, technology, and talent. It used land, public housing, and compulsory savings to support long-term stability. And whenever one growth model approached its limits, it moved toward higher-value industries. From manufacturing to finance, biotechnology, advanced logistics, and digital services. Did Singapore become rich because it is small, or despite being small? The answer is both. A compact state can coordinate planning, make decisions quickly, and connect policy across housing, transport, education, and industry. Yet smallness also magnifies every mistake. There is no vast hinterland to absorb the shock if shipping, trade, finance, or technology weakens. Efficiency is not optional here. It is a condition of survival. The next chapter may be harder. Singapore is aging, while birth rates remain low. Inequality and living costs test the promise that growth will benefit everyone. Rival ports, financial centers, and technology hubs are improving. Climate change and rising seas threaten a low-lying island directly, demanding decades of expensive protection. And tension between the United States and China places Singapore in a delicate position. Its prosperity depends on remaining connected to both, even as each side pressures the world to choose. Singapore does not prove that natural resources are irrelevant. It proves that resources take many forms. Location is a resource. People are a resource. Trust, institutions, time, and the capacity to plan are resources too. Singapore became wealthy not because nature was generous, but because scarcity became discipline and vulnerability became motivation. On a map, Singapore is only a tiny dot. Yet in the global economy, that dot sits where ships, capital, data, and ambition meet. Its lesson is not that every nation can copy its model. It is that a country is defined not by the area it possesses, but by the value it creates on every square meter of its land.